everyone, this is Lomi, and last week I shared the process of casting my new doll Rune. This week I'm going to share a little bit about the cleanup process that comes next. This isn't something that we usually get to see, but pretty much all dolls have to go through this. Every doll that gets made is going to have flash like what's on this head cap, they're going to have pore tabs, and for home casts like these, it's not uncommon for the dolls to have a few bubbles here and there. Most professional casters use vacuum chambers when making silicone molds, and they'll cast the resin in pressure pots, but I don't have those, and that means I have to do a little extra cleanup work on my dolls. I ended up casting 5 different heads and 5 head caps, and I used 2 different kinds of resin. I used smooth cast, which was highly recommended, and I ended up not liking it at all. I found that the Alumilite resin was a little bit more translucent, while the smooth cast was a bit more detailed, but it also had really severe issues with pitting. I suspect this is because I didn't have a pressure pot for casting, but you can see that the head that was done with smooth cast is really awful, and it's going to need a lot of work. And on top of that, this resin actually ended up damaging my mold, so I'm definitely not keen on ever using it again. I still want the head to be usable, so I'll be doing some repair work on it and turning it into something that I can utilize, but I'm not a fan of the smooth cast resin, and I'm going to stick to the Alumilite from now on. So as far as cleaning up the flash, most of the time it can just be kind of scraped off or peeled off, but I also like to go over the edges with a razor blade just to make sure it's nice and smooth. This isn't really cutting so much as scraping, but the blade is pretty sharp. I know it looks kind of dangerous, but you're much less likely to cut yourself with a sharp blade than a dull one, so I'm not too concerned about just running this along the edges. I also used wire cutters to cut off all the pore tabs, but if they had been thicker, I probably would have wanted to use a Dremel or some other kind of cutting tool. For getting the flesh out of eyes, I tried to use my files to scrape it out, but some of the eyes had places where the resin had bubbled in the corners, and those had to be cut out with a knife. Using a file to smooth the edges of the eyes means that some of the eyes might end up shaped a little bit differently from one head to the next. I think you usually get a cleaner cast when working with a pressure pot, but what I have here more than meets my needs. I use my Dremel for cleaning up the neck holes and also for grinding off what's left of the pore tabs. It doesn't take much because the resin is really soft and easy to drill through. I was kind of interested to see how the Alumilite Amazing Casting Resin would compare to the Smooth Cast resin, and there wasn't too much of a difference in how they felt or how they performed when being drilled or sanded. Work like this is very messy, so anytime you're sanding or drilling resin, you always want to make sure you are wearing a proper respirator, because not only is the dust toxic, but the fumes that they emit are toxic too. Because I cut the mold, the space above the ears and a little below the ear on one side have a little bit of a seam line that has to be sanded off, but it's nothing too severe. I start my sanding on the seam lines and for smoothing the edges with a 320 grit Tamiya sanding sponge, and then I finish using 3M 600 grit sandpaper. The files that I use for cleaning up the edges of the eyes and also for getting the bumps off the heads are some X-Acto files, and I've had these for a while. They last a really long time when you're using them on something as soft as resin. Going through this process by myself and seeing how much work goes into finishing a doll even after it's cast and done, that really gives me a big appreciation for what the doll companies do. And I think it's a really interesting and unique thing to be able to share. Out of the 5 heads that I cast, I kept the one that looked the best and didn't have any bubbles and put it aside to use as a secondary master for if I ever remake these molds. I had decided to go ahead and sand and finish all 5 head caps, but you only see me working on 4 different heads. I plan on painting each one with a different expression, and I'm really looking forward to doing that, but before I paint anything, I have to patch up the bubbles with a little bit of epoxy putty. I used Milliput for this because it's white like the resin, and I don't think it'll show as badly if I end up having places that don't cover very well. It also responds very well to water, which means I can just use my fingertip dipped in water or one of my little silicone shaping tools to help smooth things out, so I won't end up needing to do a lot of sanding to smooth out these repairs. Most of these bubbles wouldn't be visible. I think the only ones that would be really visible are a few on the head cap that are on the outer edge, and I think there's one head that had one on the upper rim, and then 2 heads had a little bubble on the ears that needed to be filled in. These would be considered a C-grade cast, and while some doll makers will sometimes sell C-grade casts, doll companies never will. Aside from that though, and me needing to get a few sanding twigs to really smooth out the edges of the eye wells, I think these have turned out pretty well. I use my dental tools and my silicone shaping tools for clay to get the ear as smooth as possible, but this will need just the tiniest bit of touch-up sanding. You can see on the head that had the really bad pitting on the surface, I've modified the eyes, and I'm actually going to split that off into its own video because I get a lot of requests for information on how to do that particular modification. So I'm going to do one whole video specifically about that. This is just about the polishing and finishing of the surface. I really wanted to drill out holes for the magnets for the heads and head caps today, but the magnets ended up not coming in on time, so instead I'm just going to show you how I mark them. To make sure my holes line up, I use a little bit of acrylic paint. This is tulip fabric paint because it's in a tube, so it's really easy to manipulate. I put a dot on the head where I want the magnets to go, and then put the head cap on it, and the paint will squish up onto the head cap so that the 2 points that I drill will end up perfectly aligned. So on one of the Alumilite resin heads, I had a place where I had accidentally nicked it with something while putting it down, and then there's the pitted head, which will need a lot of filler. I just squeeze a bit out onto some scrap cardboard or plastic, whatever I have handy, and then I apply it to the doll's head with a popsicle stick. This lets me spread it on smoothly, and then I can scrape the excess back off so there will be less to sand. Filling the head that has the severe pitting, you can see that I'm going to have to do a lot of sanding no matter what because there's going to be so much putty on this, and there are so many little holes. I spread it on as best as I can, but at some point I give up and start using my finger to spread it on because it's faster and easier, and it really gets it down into the holes just as well, so it doesn't really matter. After the putty has completely cured, I use sandpaper to clean it up. For the head that just had the little nick, I can use 600 grit sandpaper, and then it's pretty good to go. The other head needs a lot more work, so I use one of my sanding sponges for that, and you can see all these red spots that are left behind. Those are pits where there were bubbles on the surface of the resin, like little pock marks and pinholes. And it still needs a little cleanup around the edge, but this was horrible. And I would never recommend using this resin without a pressure pot just because of how bad this experience was. So another problem I ran into along the way was I did not account for the fact that my resin casts would be slightly smaller than the original master, and I sculpted the master with 12mm eye wells because Rune uses 12mm eyes. After the mold shrinkage and the resin shrinkage, the cast heads have eye wells that are just small enough that the 12mm eyes will not go in. I'm going to drill them out, but I also found that I was going to need a 12mm eye base that had a smaller iris because his eyes are so small. So I quickly designed one with Tinkercad, and then I 3D printed it, and I'm going to use that to make new eye bases, but I'd really like to make the eye wells big enough that I can use the LED eyes I've already created, because I really don't want to have to go through the trouble of making the LED eyes again. Drilling out the eye wells isn't hard. I just use my Dremel and one of these little like grinding and cutting bits, but it's not always as easy as just making it bigger because it changed the shape of the front of the eye well as well, where the eye opening is. So I'm going to have to go in with the power tools and also with hand sandpaper to reshape that really carefully to make sure the eyes sit the way that they need to, because right now, just grinding out the edges, it still has the eye sitting back a little too far, and that means that there's a little bit of gapping to the sides. So lesson learned when I'm making my master, make the eye wells bigger than what I actually want it to use in the end. In the next couple of weeks I'll begin painting these, but I'll be sure to check in next week with that eye modification project because I think you're gonna like that one. That's all for today though. Thanks for watching. Bye.